Hi, my name is Malcolm Clemens Young. I'm the Dean of Grace Cathedral, and welcome to the Forum Online. Today, as we continue our exploration of the Cathedral's theme of healing, we're going to talk about the story of America and the story of survival, hope, and grace. My guest tonight is Lenny Duncan. When he was 13, Lenny was a poor, queer Black teenager from Ray Street in West Philadelphia who climbed aboard a Greyhound bus and left his family behind. What did he find in the small towns and big cities he explored in his journey across America? And what makes his story so rich, so heartbreaking, and so surprisingly patriotic? Today, Lenny is a pastor of the Jubilee Collective, a community in Vancouver, Washington. He's the author of Dear Church, a love letter from a Black preacher to the whitest denomination in the US. And his new book is United States of Grace, a memoir of homelessness, addiction, incarceration, and hope. Lenny, I'm so glad to have you joining us tonight. What a blessing it is to see you. I have been living with you so much as I've been reading your books, and it's such a pleasure to have you here with us. And we really appreciate you making the time for us.
Well, I appreciate you having me. I know the good work that Grace Cathedral does, and it resonates outside the Bay Area. So it's a real honor to be here. And thank you so much for having me on the show. Which side you go with, Reverend or Malcolm? I know. I know. Mal, are you sure? Because I know you're Episcopalians. For sure. I don't want the other Episcopalians to get mad at me.
No. It's got to be Malcolm. Otherwise, I won't know who you're talking to.
All right, Malcolm, you got it.
Yeah, definitely. It's so funny because I one of my favorite parts of United States of Grace was, I was just around Telegraph Avenue in the 80s in Berkeley, California. And it was it's hard. I tried to explain to my kids about what it was like back then. And it's just so different now. But there are just so many kids kind of living in People's Park in Telegraph Ave. And there's so many times I've looked back on that. I'm just like, they're all the same age as me. Like, why didn't I take more time? Like, I had interactions with them, but I didn't really find out what their stories were in the way I wanted to. And so that was one of the things I loved the most about your book. It was kind of like fulfilling this desire that I've had for a long time to just make some kind of connection with people who are having that experience. But I wonder if you talk just about what that was like. I mean, in all these different cities to be out there on the streets and just the community people you were meeting and just what that was like.
Yeah, I mean, and thank you for that question. People's Park is one of the places where I learned probably the entire political lens that I walk around with today, right? And it is hard to explain that what the advent of the internet age, the legalization of marijuana, the change of cultural mores towards houselessness did to these communities that were sort of embedded throughout the United States. But it's hard to capture that for people, right? That there were these very rich communities of young kids, many of whom were queer. I mean, this is the advent of reparative therapy. My friends are being snatched off the street by white vans. We don't have names for the stuff we're doing. No one's saying I'm polyamorous.
Right.
No one has names for what we're doing. No one has names for what we're going through, the secondhand trauma of just living in this country. No one is talking about. I mean, people are, but we don't have access to it, right? And so you have these multiple layers. You have these really rich queer communities, these really rich communities that are built sort of in between the shadow places that we all walk past every day. And for a long time, they were thriving. I mean, there was a route that you could run from Boulder, Colorado to the Bay Area up to LA or up to Portland or 100 other places that you could just really spend your life as a young kid just sort of traveling. And it was different too. There wasn't the internet. So if I'm hanging out with a backpack and I look 14 years old and I'm in a pack of other 14, 15-year-olds, no one's going to ask where you're going. And so, the best plan we had for you when you were a kid is we put your picture on a milk crate, milk carton. And our hope was that someone else would drink that milk carton, put it back in the fridge, but somehow remember your face and then like contact an authority. I mean, it was very different times. So it was easier to get lost in America.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I wonder if you can just describe like some of the people that you knew in those days and just kind of what they were like and what, yeah, I mean, being 14, it's just like such a formative time. Like, I love the way you talk about, what you learned in Berkeley, People's Park. What I learned there was amazing too. But maybe you can tell us about just some of the people you knew, like maybe an example of somebody you remember from back in those days.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Hitchhiking, particularly in the late '90s, was still it was becoming rarer and rarer, and there's this sense that it was like the last great American adventure, and there really was a time where anyone would stop. So you would get anyone from, really that people would depict as my enemy today. Evangelicals from the Midwest who like would come to a screeching halt, pick me up, decide to drive an extra 200 miles out of their way because they know, the area may not be safe for someone like me, but they don't say that. And like stick $200 in my pocket and like, try and infuse me with the Holy Spirit before they stick me out the door. And the very next ride is some leftist who just left their partner who's on their way to Naropa Institute in Boulder, Colorado to like study original writings from like Hal. And you're like, okay, like that. So you're like, there's a master's degree on that, you know what I mean? Like, and when you're a kid and you're having experiences that run counter to the narratives that are the popular narratives. One of my favorite guys who picked me up was a trucker named Fireball, and he picked me up in Arizona because he knew that there was a thunderstorm coming 100 miles behind him, and that no one would pick me up where I was. I had no idea where I'd been dropped off, and that my last ride was actually setting me up for a downfall. Yeah. And, this guy's out of Arkansas. He's picking me up in New Mexico. I got, it's the mid 90s. I have like a big old anarchy tattoo. I've got long dreads, like, I'm by the side of the road and, at a crossroads in the middle of the desert, and Fireball comes and picks me up. The story's not even the book, Yeah. And he takes me to his house and like I meet his partner and like they take me out to go line dancing and buy me like my first pair of cowboy boots and like my first cowboy hat and like take me into town and show me their America, right? Show me their America. And when you're living in a world where particularly as a Black queer kid, that like you're really kind of living on the I don't want to say the good graces, but you're living under the shadow of white supremacy constantly. And it's like, and I had a very weird awareness about race. The only person who was weird in my world was my mom. My mom was white, but right. I grew up in West Philly. And so that, I didn't know white culture. And so for me, it was like, you ever watch Fraggle Rock? You remember Traveling Matt? It felt a lot like Traveling Matt in white culture, where I was just like, oh, this is cool, man. Like, so you guys are just having a big old festival and you're just going to burn this giant like wicker man out here?
Yeah, right.
That must cost a lot of money. You guys do this shit every year? Wow. Like, and I would like be blown away to have that much time, privilege, money, space, creativity to create, right? Yeah. So I would find these worlds in that were beyond anything that I could imagine. And what it told me was that it wasn't the people that were keeping me from the American dream. Anytime I met the people, they would offer me their little piece of the American dream so graciously.
Yeah.
So graciously. And really the book is the story about the people in the book.
Yeah, that's what I love about it. I mean, those individual stories. I mean, I wonder if you can talk just like about what you learned about white culture from just the Grateful Dead and just kind of that community of people who are traveling along, listening to the concerts,
Yeah, I mean, like, the late 90s, the Grateful Dead in the late 80s saw this real burst of popularity. They had their first #1 hit after putting out albums in 64.
Right. Yeah.
And so suddenly the Grateful Dead went from like this act that played like, little arenas for the last 40 years in festivals to like giant stadiums. And
Yeah,
so
I saw them at the Forum in LA. It was
right,
massive. It was
right.
just huge.
Right. And so that shift really changed the scene and a lot of people got into it. And so, this is like early 90s, Kurt Cobain's, either, on his way to death, basically.
Right.
You have hip hop really starting to make its voice in the world. Punk rock's a thing, but it's sort of like a niche thing that some people do at some clubs. And then you run into the Grateful Dead scene, I'm houseless. I need a place to go where I can make a buck. I need a place to go where I can fit in with a large group of people and no one know whose I really is, or who I belong to. Why is this 14-year-old child unattended in America, 15-year-old child unattended in America? So, people tend to ask those questions. People are good people. They're like,
Yeah.
hey, I've never seen you with an adult. What's going on with you? And, and it really had this carnival kind of atmosphere. It was, it was like everyone by the late 90s, early 90s on Grateful Dead tour, 91, 92, 93, 94, 95, and then into like Fish Tour and like other festivals I went to, you really get this sense that like they know that they're selling a nostalgia. And it's like the carnival. Now, the guy who tries to sell you the ring toss?
Yeah, Barker.
Right, the Barker. So I start to realize that it's not really the 60s esoterica anymore. And it's kind of like this gag, but in all the best ways,
Yeah, right.
And, I love that stuff. As a kid, I read Electrocoid Acid Test.
Yeah, and I was going to ask you about that. What did you like about KoolAid Acid Test as a kid? I remember reading it too when I was like 20 or so.
Right. Well, I read it when I was like 12. And I don't know. I was like a weird kid. Like I read about MK Ultra in the library and I couldn't wait to go to college. Like, you know what I mean? I was like, that sounds awesome. Which was probably a sign of things to come.
Really?
But what I liked about it was that, and it wasn't until later that what I really liked about the Electrocoid Acid Test was Tom Wolfe.
Yeah.
Right. And what I didn't realize is that what Tom Wolfe was doing was exactly what I wanted to do when I grew up. And that was the ability to grab sacred stories and make them come alive for you in the way that it feels almost like you've stumbled upon scripture no one's supposed to know about.
Yeah.
Right. And there's certain books that have that feel to it. And the amazing thing that Tom Wolfe does, because I was able to do it once with my own story, I think in certain places. But what Tom Wolfe does is he does it with everyone else's story. And the cast of characters, you're talking about Neil Cassidy, who is Dean Moriarty from On the Road, who is the influence of Bob Weir, who is the influence of Warlow and these other poets, who's hanging out with Jefferson Airplane, who's like, who are all part of this spiritual side to the anti-war movement, which is interconnecting, like with this poster I've hung out my door where like Jerry Garcia's throwing the birthday party to get like 4 Black Panthers out of jail in Oakland. And so this is all part of the scene, this is all happening as part of the atmosphere. And what I liked about it was that it just seemed like it pointed to a time in our country when the people who were older than me, who looked like they had lost all hope, had hope.
Yeah.
And Tom really captured the innocence, the naivete, the mistakes, the foilables, the scars, all of it. I mean, he didn't hide any of it.
Yeah, I love that. It's funny because, we in the United States of Grace, we come so close to you. I mean, and by necessity, we kind of come close to the people in your world. And that's what happens with Tom Wolfe. But with those people, they were at more of a distance from him. Whereas for you, I mean, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that. Like what does your family think of the book? Like, how are they doing? Like, how do you make those decisions about how much to include and how much not to? Like, how was that part of the struggle of writing?
Yeah. No, I mean, so if you notice in the chapter about my daughter, I paint that whole situation very opaque. I'm very careful with people's stories. There's a part of your story you're allowed to tell, right? So, in the book, I talk about the first time I meet my daughter. I hadn't seen her in 13 years since she was, very small. And, I talk about the train ride up,
Yeah.
and the feelings I was having and reflecting about the day I found out that I had a daughter, which was I was in county jail. And, and so I'm flashing between those two scenes. Um, but I don't ever tell you what happens when I meet my daughter. And I paint my family kind of opaquely. Part of it's because, and you didn't know this because I'm not putting it out there, but me and my partner had a separation recently. And the other part of it is because, and some of those feelings I think were gestating while I was writing the book a year ago.
Like have to come out, there's just like, we have such a depth of subconscious life that it's going to all come out in ways we don't surprise us.
Exactly. And so like there's a really surprising line where like I'm painting my former partner Bree, who I care for and is a wonderful person, I paint her in these really sort of beautiful shades, right? And reading back on it, I say this line where I'm like, hey, like the funny thing about books is like basically they capture these moments in time and that we still have struggles and things are still hard. But my family, they think it's, they're grateful that I don't make them the center of the story. My cousin, Nicole, who is a pastor in Brooklyn, New York. She is a pastor at a American Baptist church there. And she shared, one of the more interesting things, and it's actually one of the things I use in the book. I don't write about this, but when my father died, I had to organize his funeral.
Right.
And it's just funny. It was just really an opportunity to realize that how people play different roles in other people's lives, and so for a long time, my father was this, monster in my mind, right? Who had done all these awful things to me, but how, even though I'd forgiven him for that, and like here we were at the funeral, and I was like so happy to, have had these years with him, and have some sort of relationship with him, and and the whole family's gathered, like I still didn't know who he was to other people. And so what I discover is that he's the funniest uncle. He's the favorite cousin. He's the guy they call for baseball tips. He's the guy they call when they have heartache. For some people, he was the guy that they called when they wanted to talk about God because they were so faithful and they knew he wasn't faithful and they just needed to hear from someone. They needed to hear another perspective than their pastors and stuff like that. Like, he was the guy that they called when, like, almost immediately when new babies were born because they knew he'd be so happy for the family, right? So here was my father. He was so many things to other people, and I didn't have the right to take that away from anyone.
Yeah,
and
I
I
like that.
think,
I mean, we have these roles. I mean, that's what I think of all the time, just parenting roles. It's just like, the people in the congregation, they need us, but I'm not their dad. I'm not, I mean, it's just like, so it is, you just have to be smart enough to just kind of understand those different relationships and the way that you play a different role in different settings.
yeah. And so, and that was really like the revealing part. And so I try to be careful with my family's story and like what that's meant, you know what I mean? And what that means for them now, right? Because we also know that the impact of our stories are very different than the lived experiences of sometimes the people on the other side,
Yeah.
I mean, and also it's also impacted by the fact that we've just gone through a world pandemic.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh, completely.
So
Yeah,
all that stuff
been, I
too.
mean, yeah, it's been. I'm so curious about what this next regathering phase is going to be like. It's such a crucial time. But
Yeah.
I do think about a lot about your families and just the way you describe it in one of the pages of the book is you talk about just kind of like this consciousness of blackness. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about this, just how that changes over time too, because the way things looked to you 20 years ago is going to be really different than the way they look to you right now. And I wonder if you can just help us through that a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, for me, you know, what blackness was when I was younger was something to live up to. And one of the things I make a real distinction in the book is that like my family was the one that was messing up on my block. Everybody else they were going to Juma on Fridays, or they were going to Shabbat services, or they were going down to the liturgy down the street, or they were going to go down to the church and hear pastor preach, or whatever. They were on their way to Jack and Jill. They were on their way to do something, and most of my family was about 80% of them, 90, it was just my little pocket of them.
Yeah.
And so I make that distinction in the book because blackness is really what became a thing I could live up to. Reading about, Fred Hampton,
Right.
learning about Malcolm, right?
Yeah.
Learning that, and having that affect me in a certain way and my political ideology and being influenced by that as a young man. And then running into Uncle Jimmy, James Baldwin, as a queer Black writer, right?
Yeah.
And then finding this rich history, and then running into Nora Zeal Hurston and realizing that spirituality doesn't have to look like what the church gave us.
Exactly.
Right. And so, so that starts to grow. And so if you'd asked me as a child, I would have said blackness was me fitting in with the 5%er kids, or fitting in with like my Nation of Islam friends and not having them questioning me because my mother was white.
Right.
Right. Like blackness would have been the day that I crossed that. Blackness, that would have been the day that that I would have felt okay. But as an adult, what I know is that I have a proximity to whiteness, and that's okay as long as I'm willing to address it. And that holds a particular place in the African diaspora due to 400 years, of systemic oppression that was started by Black history being interrupted. And that my blackness isn't the thing that's up for question in these kind of things. And that blackness changes, right? Like now I now know that Malcolm, that Malcolm was a sex worker when he was younger, right? And so like now all of a sudden I have this queer, view of Malcolm, right? This very queer view. And then I learn a little bit more about, Bayard Rustin, or and so my sort of view on blackness starts to grow, but blackness is always a revelation. When blackness shows up, it always feels like revelation, like an unveiling, because so much of this republic is cloaked in the mythos of whiteness, American nationalism and exceptionalism, which is so tied in with all these other things. And so when blackness shows up, it feels like revelation. When Patrice and them posted Black Lives Matter on Facebook, right? It felt like a revelation, right? Or it became a revelation. When Black voters showed up to save the republic right before we lost the peaceful transition to power, which is important. You should have paid attention to that, because that's still up for grabs, right? Like we always show up as a revelation, and unfortunately that's been our position in this republic, is to not only not have the rights and the privileges of a citizen, but more specifically, we're the canary in the coal mine for freedom in this republic. And what they do to us in the daylight, they will do to you in the dark. And so you have this sort of a way that blackness shows up. And so, I try to articulate it in a way that does blackness justice. And I know that somebody will eat me alive for it on Twitter someday. I'm with it. Like, bring the noise.
Well, I mean, for me, like your story is so all-American. Your mother's family is all-American family. Your father's family is all-American family. And it's just interesting to just pay attention to just that dynamics of how you have a way of being able to relate with both worlds. You're right. And when blackness shows up, it's a revelation for white people, and it's a revelation for Black people too. I mean, to have these great poets and musicians and jazz artists and
you have to wake up to it. Yeah, you have to chase it and wake up to it as a young kid. No one's handing it to you. Yeah,
definitely. There's so much in here that I love so much. I was reading it, and I was just like, oh, it's not going to be enough time for Lenny and me to talk. I just too much. And if I ever ask you anything that's just like going beyond the pale, let me know, because that's part of the power of it. It's just, it's good. Like, so you're so open with it. But I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just, what ordinary Americans need to know about just the criminal justice system. And in particular, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about just, your experiences in solitary confinement, what that means, the juvenile justice system, et cetera.
Yeah. It's interesting because when I look back, and I was I shared about this at a couple of events, and I've been sharing about this on Twitter. I was recently diagnosed with ADHD, which gave me this whole reframing for my childhood. And so for a long time, I thought I was kind of a never-do-well kid who left home and sold pot, got in a little trouble and was houseless, and thank God, God found him and all that stuff. But really, with this reframing, what I received is that I was a queer disabled kid who was criminalized. Almost from first grade.
Yeah.
And when we talk about the school to prison pipeline, when we talk about how particularly assigned male at birth, Black folks show up, in class with the hyper, sometimes this hyperactive type, and so what's interesting is, I look back on that, right? And so here I was houseless. I was trying to leave a dangerous environment at home that was abusive. I'm trying to make my way in the world. I've been on my own from, by the time the criminal justice system really sinks its claws in me, I'm like 16, 17 years old. So I've been on my own, houseless for 4 years. No one's trying to figure that out. No one's trying to figure out where I'm coming from. No one's trying to figure out underlying issues. What they're trying to figure out is whether or not they should give me juvenile life, right? Which is until you're 27 in Colorado, or 24 or 26 at the time. It was like something outrageous, And when you're 16, 17 years old, you're looking at 10 years for selling a couple bags of pot to a cop who kind of bullied you into it. He was like, "You sure you don't got no weed?" And then you find yourself in these crazy situations. So what the criminal justice system truly is it's a product of us not wanting to love our neighbors. You don't want to know why the guy across the street is houseless. You don't want to know why the person around the corner is beating their partner. You don't want to know why the kid out front is hustling in front of your brownstone to make some money for his kid. You don't want to ask those questions. You don't want to know their name. You don't want to care for them. What you do, or what we do as Americans, is you hire an armed concierge service who show up, who are comprised of people who have very little training for a variety of situations and a lot of training for one situation. And these poor guys, in a lot of ways, they're put in, an impossible situation too, right? And so, and they're suffering from PTSD because they're living 12 hours a day in the same conditions that most BIPOC people are left in, right? And so my point is that the criminal justice system shadows that. It's because you don't want to know what happens to the neighbor you don't want to love after they get them out your way. And what they do, particularly to kids, is I can tell you the juvenile justice system is incredibly more violent. There's a lot more sexual violence in the criminal justice system, and they have a way of we can't put you in solitary. So what they do is they put you in a room that's the size of a 1-bedroom apartment with 2 mats across from each other with some of the worst offenders. So sometimes you're in a room with some of the worst sexual predators, right? And then they take that kid out, and then you have to leave, and then they put you in another environment, right, where they know you won't do well, and it all happens over again, and there are good people in the system. I mean, one of the things that's really hard about growing up is you realize there are incredibly good people in oppressive systems. Sometimes it's chock full of them. Uh, but it doesn't change the aggregate effect of those systems. And so, you end up spending like close to like a year and a half with like 2-3 days in general population till you get into a fight, or you freak out, or you just get scared, or something happens, and it all starts over again. Until one or two things happens. Either you get broken or you get hardened by the system, and you start like, exhibiting the behaviors that the other inmates exhibit to survive. Right. And this sort of criminalization of houseless folks, I mean, most people, you know, you know, mo- most people in county jail to this day would do better with a psychiatric evaluation than they would with a criminal record. About 70% of the folks in county jail usually are because we don't care for folks who are, who have mental illness at all. So, it's just a lot of that stuff. And, I could tell you the one thing is it's worse than you think it is.
Yeah.
Like no matter how, no matter where you fall in your political ideology, it's worse than you think it is. And it's how I landed on abolition. It's just a system that's so corrupt, it just has to be abolished.
Mm.
And I don't know what that means, right? I'm not one of the experts, but I can tell you as a victim of it, um, there's very little hope for people to find a way out.
Mm.
It's just the way it's stacked against you. They let you out of jail and they give you 28 days to do what you've never been able to do, which is be a citizen. Oh, and by the
Yeah,
way, while you're
have
trying
a
to be a
job,
citizen,
right? Get
right?
clean on drugs and alcohol. All these things it's like an impossible task that you
It's an
couldn't do.
impossible.
Yeah.
Right. It's an impossible task you weren't pulling off before they interrupted your life. You know what I mean? Now they've interrupted your life. They put a felony on your jacket. Oh, and by the way, you can't get financial aid to go to school for like 15 years at least. And so it's just like no way out, right? And so uh it and the reason why is because it profits states, it profits the state, and it profits corporations, and it profits state budgets, in particular, and federal budgets.
Yeah, so
And
people have a
that's
vested interest in continuing and expanding the system. Yeah,
exactly.
that's heartbreaking. We had the author of Far from the Tree on a couple of weeks ago, and he was talking about just the schizophrenia, the number of people who used to have like institutional care in the 50s, but after deinstitutionalization are just on the streets. It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. You mentioned a little bit about just your kind of awareness of queerness, and that's one of the. I'm sure people have talked to you about this, but in Dear Church, it's the one time when you're kind of reflecting on yourself. You're like, I'm not sure if I'm going to tell you this yet. It's easy to type it on my computer when I'm alone in my room, but I'm just not. I don't know what it's going to be like when I say to the world, I'm queer. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your consciousness of that, just kind of as it's evolved. And it's Pride Week coming up, and it just seems like a really important time for us to be thinking about that.
Yeah, I mean, for me, queer culture was going down to what, is still affectionately called by all those who live in it, who are all queer, the neighborhood in Philadelphia, and like running down there and like, standing inside a queer bookstore and like looking at books to find out stuff about myself. And the guy behind the counter is watching me, but he also thinks it's cute and I'm trying to steal it. And then I steal it and I run down the street, queer culture felt like a secret agent. Like you went to certain bars and you went to certain places and you did certain things at certain times and you met up with people. Um, and it felt dangerous.
Yeah.
It felt a lot more dangerous at that time, and you felt it. You just kind of had the sense that um, America had thought that they had stopped that that really a lot of the heartland of America like celebrated AIDS and was very happy that they thought a whole culture was being punished
Right, right.
and a whole people was being punished, right? And then they found out their kids were queer
Yeah.
and they absolutely lost their shit in the 90s. And then, like, you know, I mean, they started doing crazy things, like, you know, like, not to be ableist and excuse that language, but like, you know, it started doing like really like just dangerous things to people. You know, and that, but you felt that resentment in the air, you know, and you knew that like if you hit on the wrong person, they could kill you and
Right.
probably get away with it, right? And probably get away with it.
Yeah, if you think about it, I
But
mean, your closest call in the book, the closest you came to death was around that, you know.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
You know, you do a good job of describing just kind of like just the danger. And you're right. There's a way in which people are drawn together when you do feel like it's a risk to share something with somebody, and it's the two of you kind of sharing that thing and knowing too that you're in danger.
yeah. And so that was a lot of queer culture for me. As I was writing Dear Church, and as I was, you know, ordained in the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, um, it felt important. There's not a lot of openly queer Black males in my denomination, and you know, gender is such a construct. I mean, there's the question is, do I even count as one? But my point is that uh, you know, that felt important.
Yeah,
It
yeah.
felt, you know, it just felt important. And I don't know, like, I think I'm like either number, you know, I'm like one of, I think, like five, I think, openly queer Black males in my denomination or something like that, like a really small number, you know, and I was like real early on, and no one made like any fanfare about it, but it felt important to me. Um, you know, I could still remember the sound of my dad's face voice when he called me faggot the first
Yeah.
time.
Uh,
I still remember that. Like I remember how that felt, you know? And I just wanted like see a world where like, you know, little queer like Black kids can like see someone and be like, "Oh, I could be a faith leader." I don't know why church is going to be over in 20 years, but I could do that. You know, like if I want, right? Like if I want if I want to
Yeah, I
if I
mean, that's what
want
I
to
like about it. It's like the solidarity. And you're right. There's something that your dad saw in you that just that you know that you as a child has had no idea about. And yeah,
yeah.
it would be great to make a world where no one has to have that experience, you know. And the only way it's going to happen is like through those moments of solidarity, and which are difficult because you know even like I said, there's subconscious things that come up, and it could feel that you're struggling with it as you're writing it, but it's still really important, you know. I
Yeah,
want
absolutely.
that so much about like the ordination stuff that I'm interested in too. It's just like how would you describe your calling? Like how did you find a home in the church, and how has that kind of shaped the ministry that you're working on right now?
You know, for me, I I mean, I wasn't happy to get a call from God. I mean, I know most of my seminary peers, they were gaga about it. I was I felt like my style was being cramped.
All right, I can imagine.
I felt like it was weird. I felt like it was super unnecessary. I really came from a school of like, so like when I found the church, I like lost one partner I was dating at the time because they thought I was cheating on them because I was sneaking away every Saturday night.
Right.
Like, but I was just going to this really sweet like young adult Catholic service that these monks threw with a couple violinists and cheese, and, you know.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
but that's like where I went, and I was embarrassed. I mean, I got to be honest with you. Like, I was embarrassed. Like, people would ask me, like, where are you going? I just wouldn't tell them, you know? Like, And so when God said that, like, you're going to be a pastor, I was like, man, wow, this is a miserable, miserable shit of an existence,
Yeah.
like really felt that in my bones too, like really felt like, oh, this is awful, like, wow, are there worse fates? And then God said, yes, you're going to be a Lutheran pastor. And I was like, oh, there are worse fates, and so really kind of walked in with that. I wouldn't say full on Jonah, but definitely not happy to be hanging in Nineveh,
Right, right.
and very unhappy that Nineveh seemed to be doing well, that the church seemed to be doing well and was pumping out leaders, and but it was one of those things, and I don't know how to explain it to people, but when I know the Spirit talks to me, and it does. I think that the Spirit talks to me because I'll listen to impossible things.
Yeah, yeah.
So when the Spirit told me that I was going to be a pastor, I had a GED that I got in county jail. That sounded impossible.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? And so I hung out with some churches where they didn't care about your credentials, and I was like, that seems dangerous. I remember saying to one guy, I was like, I just wouldn't let a doctor do surgery on me with no credentials, and I just feel like you should be credentialed to guide people into, you're saying, the afterlife, right? Like, I just want to be clear with you, right? And so, and on this planet, okay. Well, I feel like you should have some training, just call me, call me weird, but I just felt like you needed that. And then, I went to like Lancaster Bible College because it was like the only place that didn't harass me. It had an online program, and, learned about hermeneutics and
Yeah,
learned
right.
this really kind of conservative point of view, and was immediately suspicious of it. So, it was like, okay, let me see what else I could find. And then I gotta tell you, my first day of seminary, I remember having this talk with like 4 or 5 friends. I said, man, all I want is a small little church in the hood somewhere where I got to sweep up needles every morning because I know I'm in the right place. Like,
Yeah.
I just know like I'm where God wants me, and that's all I want to do. I want to be left alone. I don't want to do nothing. And God had a lot of other plans for me. But my point is, that's what call's like. Call is just like stepping into the impossible and knowing that God will make it real. Um, if you walk towards it,
Yeah.
and honoring that, right, and not knowing what it's going to look like on the other end. I have a very tense relationship with my denomination. I told them this is my last call because I really believe we should be preparing people for the world beyond the church rather than supporting institutional church, and that most of our institutions, I'm sure not yours, but most of our institutions have become like starved predators that only care for their own survival.
Yeah.
And in particular, I believe in the last year, what we saw play out was our leaders really fail us at a critical juncture in salvation history. And they have to stand before the Creator for that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, where was the offerings? Where was the sackcloth? Where was the ashes? Where was the fragrant nard? Where was the ritual? Where was the liturgy?
Yeah.
Why weren't they rubbing God's ears with God's own promises publicly?
Yeah. Yeah.
It was a lot of like, how can we survive this? And when you start noticing that, it was just a real struggle for me. And part of writing the book, one of the conclusions I kind of came to that I didn't write is that I'm really not sure that the church is God's chosen vessel on earth anymore, is what happened to me. And I never felt like that,
Yeah. Yeah.
and so.
There was so much potential, and it was just, I feel so disappointed too, just that there's so much more we could have done. I just think of all those people dying in the hospitals by themselves, and it's just like,
Right.
because someone just said that's the way it has to be, and I don't even know how we came to that conclusion. Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
why did we accept that? I mean, I just anyway, I'm with you. It was a very disappointing time for the church, but like I said,
Yeah.
I'm so glad to just celebrate again. Because some of my favorite passages in Dear Church are just, how your love for the place, in the particular people, the lady with the dyed hair who talked to me on my first Sunday when I first moved to town, and the person who's taught Sunday school for like 40 years, and the guy who feels like he has to like take care of the gardens. That church, I'm in love with it still.
Yeah, no, I it's there, right? It exists, but I think we need to focus on the people,
Yeah.
and I think it's time for us as leaders to not, because I spent a lot of years spinning my wheels, wondering what will the conference of bishops do and how will they, and then, and you know what? I'm going to focus on the people.
Yeah.
And the people that are in front of me, and not in that way that we've often heard it, where it's like just stick to your congregation and things will work out. No, I think the people are going to make a judgment on the church over its conduct over this year and over the next few years. And people vote with their feet, and I think people are ready to be practitioners. That was a huge thing, right? People were in their homes and they were like, well, how do I get the meal?
Right, exactly. That's what it makes
How
me
do I?
and they were almost apologetic and saying, we have this bread and this wine, and then the church leaders are like, that's fake communion. I mean, that made me so unhappy. I was just like,
No.
we're trying to just say, help them get through this, and we're policing the border. We should have more of a conversation about it, at least.
Well, I mean, it's the clericalism. I think
That's
is going to
totally
be the
what that
first thing that's
was.
going to have to go. Yeah, it's all clericalism, and the people aren't going to put up with it from us, and that's okay. And that's for better people than us to figure out.
Hey, so tell me about seminary. Like, what was your favorite class? Like, who are some of the people you met who were interesting? Tell me about that whole experience. Somebody, by the way, gave me advice once. They said, I can't remember whether they said after 5 years or after 10 years, but after a while, you kind of forget what it's like to be a normal person. And so I'm trying so hard never to forget that. But tell me about seminary,
Yeah, I went to the Lutheran Theological Seminary in Philadelphia that later became United Lutheran Seminary, after it joined with the historic seminary that had been like its, theological, I guess, in 1800s, its theological, I guess, adversary, Gettysburg. Um, and it was an interesting place. I was really lucky. It was an ELCA seminary, and it only had like 10 or 15, like, Lutheran kids there. But at night was the Black Church courses, and the Black Church Institute was there, and wow. I mean, so you would get these folks who would come in at night who had been working all day, who were going to take calls in areas that, like, either were as good or better than some of the calls that some of my, like, mainline or rather white mainline friends were taking, and some of them were like these really kind of like just like small churches that, why is the pastor here to get a master's? Because they just want to serve the people faithfully, and they're paying for it out of their pocket. And like, this church can't support them, but they want to support the church, right? And so you get this wide range. I remember my first public theology class, Intro to Public Theology. I think there were like 30 denominations in that room.
Yeah.
And it was like, it was wild. I was just like, wow. I took a liturgy course that was taught by an Episcopalian from General in New York, but had like 4 Kojic folks in there, 4 or 5 AME folks, 4 or 5 Episcopalians. We had 2 Moravians. We had a Quaker. I mean, and then we had folks who were like ABC, American Baptist, and then we had folks who were, who were just non-denominational and had never even thought about the Ordo ever. And we're all in the same room, trying to grasp at these 3 things, like, word, bath, meal, and what do they mean in the 21st century? And that stuff was stunning. the hard thing in seminary was, you really start to get an idea of what the institution's like. So, very early on, I realized, particularly mainline denominations, white mainline denominations, will tokenize and weaponize people of color and Black folks and other folks against queer folks, or queer folks against BIPOC folks, or against each other. And I started to realize that the church had really been infected by something that seemed otherworldly, and it took me a while to put my finger on it, but it was white supremacy,
Yeah.
or radical evil in the form of white supremacy, right?
Right.
And but that took a while. Like, I was in, my first year in seminary, it just all seemed amazing to me. I was on this big webcast with my presiding bishop about racism and all this stuff. And even though I'd seen some things during that had really shook me, I went back to school. It seemed like there were sincere people who were really trying to change things. Um, and so what was hard for me was that I'm a real true believer in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
I just can't. It's hard for me to compromise in the name of survival, mediocrity, not having a real witness in the world for maybe another 50 years. I mean, not the Episcopalians. The only thing that'll survive nuclear war is the Episcopalian retirement fund approaches. But you guys will be around forever. But the rest of us, before you purchase us all, we're going to have some struggles. And I find that, and this is just me. I'm not in charge of anything, right? I just write books and talk a lot of shit. Sometimes I teach courses at PLTS. But I'll say that if I was presiding over the funeral of something that I thought was dear and beautiful and wonderful in the world, I would not sing a dirge. I would have a New Orleans style funeral.
Yeah.
I would be the second line. I would take whatever was left and I would break open that nard and lay it all over the body of this beautiful thing and praise God for what happened and take those assets and see what the people of God could do in the next thing. I would believe in resurrection. And our church is really, really, I mean, the closest they've come to seeing an eschatological event was 2020.
Yeah.
And they didn't budge. No one was like, you know what, we should empty this endowment, absolutely pour all this money right now into supporting like X, Y, and Z for any. None of that happened. There was a lot of tightening of the belts. I don't know about your denomination. My denomination put out more restrictions for pastors in the middle of the pandemic. Because that's what we needed. Like, what we needed right then was for you to rearrange all the rules about our conduct while everything we're doing is being taped.
Yeah.
Right?
That's funny. I didn't even realize that.
You know what I mean? So it's just funny. Like, it's just like, what will it take? What will it take for the church to rouse from its lethargy?
Yeah.
Right? Michael Brown wasn't enough, right? Trayvon Martin wasn't enough. Sandra wasn't enough. And now we know George Floyd wasn't enough.
Yeah.
So what's it take? How do we get the church into the fight? I asked that question in Dear Church, and I kind of leave that question to the side because I realized, at the end of the day, we need to invest in people and invest in each other. What the Republic is moments like this, Malcolm, where you and I lower our disposition to each other just enough that we actually believe the Imago Dei is real in each one of us. Yeah. And we're going to walk away changed from this, right?
Yeah, exactly.
We're going to carry that to someone else.
That's what I think is so powerful is this. It's like the Spirit. The Spirit is what's so powerful. I mean, it's just, and that's us unbreakable. And regardless where the church is, the Spirit is going to be upon this world. And it's going to draw people together in the name of Jesus and to do good things in the world and to to fight against injustice. It's going to always be the case, but it's just going to look different than what anybody expects. And the Spirit's
Absolutely.
always bringing forth something new that we just don't even understand yet, you know?
Well, and it's also mighty suspicious that, someone whose entire livelihood depends on you constantly tells you how goddamn indispensable they are. Like, okay, that seems weird, church. Maybe, like here's the truth, man, is that like maybe we don't deserve to have a witness. Maybe
Yeah,
this is the church we deserve.
yeah,
And
yeah,
like, and we have to wrestle with that.
yeah,
We have to wrestle with like how we showed up in this time. And like, yes, there were tons of instances where we showed up great. I'm not talking about the people on the ground. We're always doing the work. We're the ones in the clothing bins. We're the ones who are feeding people.
yeah,
We're the ones who, well, I'm talking about who we are nationally on the scene. The entire idea of what a Christian is has been irreparably damaged. And, most of our denominations are just playing damage control like they're a corporation.
mm, yeah.
I mean, you got denominations adopting like Harvard business plans and calling it like new church models. Like, what is happening? Like, what is going on?
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
And I'm sure it's all great organizational leadership stuff, but like, I just, it doesn't feel right.
yeah, yeah. I know what you
I,
mean.
I, I, so it makes me a little uneasy, and I'll stop ranting.
No, no, it's not ranting at all. It's just like now's the moment to start taking stock of what's going on. Now's
Yeah,
the moment where, if we can't change now, when will we be able to change?
absolutely. Get it in before the cement dries.
I know completely, because things are, it's a new world. We're not going back to what it was before.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're going to have a lot of struggles with. I think a lot of people are going to struggle with the fact that actually the American Republic died January 6, 2021, because the only truly American miracle is that a sitting general turned over power to a civilian government. It's the
Yeah,
only time it only happened once in world history, and it's never happened again. And
yeah,
now that's over.
yeah,
So that's up for grabs, and I think the American consciousness is really going to wrestle with that. Um, and I think there are a large group of people who want the world to go back to the way it was. I think there's people who want worship, and particularly church. Church is set up for a world the way it was. It's not set up for this world. So that but I also think there's a large segment of people who saw um, the chasm of difference in experience, privilege, class, wealth, um, race, uh, sexual identity and gender identity in a way that they can't unsee.
yeah, yeah. I agree.
You know,
I agree. And
so
because I mean, that's another thing we didn't even talk about, just how different people experience the pandemic in such totally different ways. From living in a ski cabin in some, resort in the Rockies to, being on the streets in New York City and watching the ambulances going by hour after hour as thousands of people died because of their social location. But
yeah,
yeah, I mean, what I wanted to talk to you about, there's so many more. I want to talk to you about Donald Trump. I want to talk to you about the Capitol riots. I want to talk to you about so many more things, but we're out of time. We have 1 hour, but we'll have to, you tell us what you're working on next, and then we'll get together again. We'll do it again, but in person next time. It'll be fun.
oh, it'd be great, absolutely. So right now, I'm at the really well. I mean, my last sermon Sunday. I got three more sermons, and I'm taking a nice big break.
Isn't that great?
Um,
That's the greatest
I'm
moment. I love that.
I'm on my way. I'm on my way. And I am just named the public theologian at Pacific Lutheran Seminary
Oh,
over in
great.
Berkeley, and
Great.
I'll be working over there with the Reverend Doctor Donna Allen, and actually working under, to be quite frankly. I mean, this the incredible woman is theologian, bringing a lot of the community building and generating that womanism brings with a chaplain's eye.
Yeah.
And what we're working on is a program where it will be all BIPOC theological and intellectual sources, not all theological, all BIPOC and queer teachers, and then the third leg based on mysticism. basically helping you to grab practices that wake up the spirit, encourage you to be a practitioner, and prepare you for the world as it is. We can't wait for people to defund the police, or we can't wait for politicians to do that. But what we can do is we can train you to intervene in mental health situations as a leader in your church. And we don't mean just clergy. We mean as a leader in your community, in your church, you, the person listening, you can intervene in these situations, and you can be trained to de-escalate them, and you can be trained to help these folks so the police never even get called.
Yeah.
And you can do it from a faithful perspective that doesn't have any particular theological view. Chaplains do it all the time in hospitals. And so what does it mean to prepare people for not only the world beyond the church, but to be chaplains to the revolution? And a lot of other really exciting stuff. So we're just forming the ideas. Pray for us. We just received a $50,000 planning grant from the Lilly Endowment, and we are working on the next stage to hopefully be in the running for the 1 million, so we can really get this program off the ground. So that's something I'm currently working on. I can't get into details, but you'll be hearing a lot more about a media thing I'm doing. I think that's all I can contractually say. But a big media thing that'll be coming out within a month, that you won't miss. So I don't have to talk too much more about that. But that's it. Really, I'm trying to do that. Working with Jubilee Collective here in Vancouver, Washington. That's about my work right now. And talking about this book, I got to be honest with you. I'm a big believer in the Republic, and the Republic isn't our institutions. It isn't our leaders. It isn't our systems. And it isn't about setting aside our history for some rose-colored picture. It's us, and we're fighting for. You are worth fighting for. If you're within the sound of my voice, I would die for you. You're worth fighting for. You're worth living for. You're worth growing for. And so what does it mean to capture that and to believe in that again? Yeah. What's it mean to believe in each other? So hopefully you pick up a copy, and the audiobook drops tomorrow. So you get to hear me read it.
Right on. So and you're the reader for it.
I'm the reader, which is right. You have to
be authentic.
Yeah, well, you have to. Well, you know this, but most people don't know that you actually have to audition for your own.
Yeah,
audio.
Right. Of course, because they might find somebody who's better at being you than you.
Yeah. Yeah, it's weird. It's very weird.
It's very weird. Well, please join me next week when my guest will be Kim Jackson, state senator from District 41 in Georgia. She's an Episcopal priest, and with her spouse, Trina, a lifelong advocate for social justice. We rely on your support for the forum. Gifts of any size make a difference. You can give on gracecathedral.org or texting THINK to 76278. Lenny, it's such a pleasure. Like I said, I just wish we had more time together. But thank you so much for your heart, for being able to show us things that are not comfortable to share, and just for being an agent of God's love and mercy in the world. God bless you in your ministry.
Oh, thank you so much. And I look forward to coming over and visiting you real soon.
Yeah, I'll come over to Berkeley too. We'll go for a walk through our old stomping grounds.
That sounds good.
All right. Thanks so much for coming. Take care now.
Thank you.
Yep.